Hey, friends, I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Ssemanda, the intuitive psychiatrist, and you are listening to Stepping into Soul Power. Friends, so a lot of us we're going through some hard times, and there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of heartache. We are not well, or as well as we could be. And our next guest has a unique way of really looking at wellness. She is a powerhouse, creator of quantum human design. She's got this wonderful book, Quantum Wellness, Healing Your Mind, Body, and Spirit with Human Design. More than 30 years of health research, energy psychology, human design. Dr. Karen Parker, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, yes. So, uh, a lot of us we're not doing great. You have come up with this new novel way of really looking at wellness, well-being. Can you take us down how you came down this path?
Well, first of all, I would say I don't think the way that what I'm teaching is really that new.
Mm.
Really what I'm teaching or talking about is the power of narrative or the power of story. And really human beings, we are storytellers and we've been storytellers forever. And I think in our modern world, the art of storytelling, it's not that it's been lost, it's mutated, right? We're telling stories on Instagram and Facebook, but stories are they're very short and they're very short-lived, and they're kind of snippets, bits and pieces of a moment in our lives, and to a certain degree, those moments become part of our identity, and we're not looking at the entire spectrum of our stories. And so, what I'm really talking about in the book is that we have to be really mindful of our stories. We have to be really mindful of where do we stop and start our stories, because a lot of us are telling stories about who we are, our identity, and we've cultivated that story in a moment of crisis in our life, in a moment where maybe something happened or we became a victim of something, or our perception was that we became a victim of something. And we tell and define our story from that moment, and we forget the whole redemption arc of what comes after, right? So if you tell, I do this, I teach storytelling sometimes to high school kids, which is totally fun because they think their life is over at 16, right? That they've seen it all. And, getting in there and saying, "Look, if you define yourself from this moment," and this is true for all of us as adults, right? If we start defining ourselves for who we were at 16, I mean, that would be hilarious for me personally. I was like a punk rocker at 16, and I had like no hair and it was red. What little I had was red, and I wore, jeans and safety pins, and that's a tiny part of my narrative, but that discounts the entire arc of what happened next in the life of Karen, in the story of Karen. And so many times what's happening for us is when we get stuck with money issues or pain in the body or relationship issues, it's because we're stuck in a story that has left out the redemption arc of where we are now or how we got to where we are right now. So in quantum wellness, what I do is I lay out using human design a systematic way to start looking at, okay, what story am I telling? What identity have I internalized? And is this story that I'm telling a story that says it's okay and it's safe for me to be who I am and how I am? And if it's not, how do we take back control of that narrative so that we begin to tell an authentic story and use that story as a creative point for the rest of our lives?
Oh, so much good there. So much good there. For those people who aren't quite familiar with what human design is, can you give us a brief snippet of what does that entail?
Totally. So human design is a system of personality analysis. So I would kind of put it in the same category as astrology for the more woo-woo minded person, or Myers-Briggs, or any of these personality tests that we take. It is a synthesis of Eastern and Western astrology, the Chinese I Ching, the Hindu chakra system, Judaic Kabbalah, and a little smidgen of quantum physics. Really what it is this, it's a way of looking at how you process energy, how you experience the world through the lens of ancient and modern archetypes. So if you think about the I Ching, the Hindu chakra system, Judaic Kabbalah, if you look at all these little esoteric components of the system, they're really all based on archetypes. So it's really just an archetype based way of exploring what story am I telling? What story is my soul curriculum? Using your birthday, birth time, and birthplace, you generate a chart. So that chart to me is what I like to consider your soul curriculum. So what's my curriculum in this lifetime? What am I here to learn from? How am I here to experience the world to either enhance or challenge me in this lesson? And ultimately, what are my gifts or my strengths? What story parts, what parts of the human story am I here to really amplify, optimize, and share with the world?
And so when you're working with someone, um, can you give us a step-by-step, uh, idea of, like, how do they go about reframing, the story that they're telling themselves?
So, first of all, you can do this with or without human design. Human design is a great tool, but it's definitely not the only way to do this process. And literally, what I have people do at the most base level is I will, and we can do this even for people listening, is stop and just take a moment and ask yourself, what stories am I telling? We'll use money as an example because money's it's a pretty triggering topic, right? It's a good topic to talk about. What stories do I tell about money? Or a different way of saying that might be, what beliefs do I have about money? And those beliefs might be, money comes to me every day in the mail. That's a good one, right? Or a more common one is money is hard, or money is bad, or money corrupts, or money, is evil. And so those belief systems that we have, those are part of our story about money. So if you in this moment are sitting here going, well, actually, I have some pretty bad beliefs about money. They are, I don't like money. It's uncomfortable. It's scary. It creates stress in my body when I think about it. You literally can sit down and talk about your money story in a fantastical, or write about your money story in a fantastical or a creative way. And literally, if you have, this is invitation for an exercise to anybody listening. When you're done listening, and don't do this while you're driving. And make a list of everything that comes up for you when you think about money. What's your beliefs? What stories you have? Where did those stories come from? What did you learn? How did you learn those stories? That's the beginning of your story. You're going to literally sit down and, using creative writing, write a story about yourself. You are going to be the hero in your story. And as you, the hero in your story, you're going to start your story off with where you are right now with your beliefs about money. So maybe you might say, once upon a time, there was a woman who believed that making money was really hard. This is my personal story. There was a time in my personal story where if I had written my story, it would be, this woman was a full-time single parent. She had 5 kids, a newborn baby, 4 teenagers, and they all had to eat, right? And she had to feed all these kids. And she was working very, very hard. She grew up in a family where she learned to work very, very hard. She was trained very well to work very, very hard, making just enough. In fact, that just enough story was so strong that every time she made a little more than enough, something would happen, like the car would break down, or,
Mhm.
some of you have had this story, right? And that'd be part 1 of the story. In the second part of the story, you go through what we call the challenge, or in the hero's journey. It's the place where you confront the shadow aspects of the story. So in my case, when I rewrote the story for myself, I literally created what I'll call the money fairy. Okay, so that was where I was at one time. I had a mystical encounter. So in my story, till one day she was walking in the woods and she encountered the money fairy. And the money fairy sat down with her and talked about her money beliefs. And the money fairy explained to this woman, hey, you know what? Money isn't actually that hard. Money can be magical and money can be empowering. Money can come to you easily. And the woman thought about this lesson for a long, long time. And she took it home with her and she took that lesson into her heart. And she started to explore, what would the world look like if I actually thought that money could be easy?
Mm.
And it began to integrate that story. She began to realize, oh, money can be easy. And she started to have experiences that validated that story, that made the money fairy seem pretty cool and pretty accurate. This is a very, very short version of that story. I would really encourage anybody, if you have a story that's really keeping you stuck, sit down and do a creative writing process with it, where you take yourself from where you are right now, find the blessings in the current situation, because there's always a blessing in it, even though it's hard, have some kind of a challenge or some kind of mystical experience in your story and rewrite it from a fantastical perspective and come out the other end. Does it change you immediately? No. But here's what happens is when we start to tackle our narrative on the creative part of our being, using the sensual, emotional parts of ourselves, the storytelling part of ourselves, what happens is in that process, we bypass those parts of the brain that are oftentimes patterned, that are rigidly clinging to that pattern because that's a survival pattern that we've learned. When we try to act, move and shift those patterns, it oftentimes triggers doubt and suspicion, sometimes self doubt and suspicion. And we have to work really, really hard to untangle ourselves from those preset patterns. When we, instead of trying to reason and logic and process these things, old beliefs with that reasoning part of ourselves, and instead move over into this creative, expressive, emotional piece, we actually can change the story faster. Not only do we change the story faster, we actually re-regulate the body. We can actually improve immune function. We increase resilience. We increase our capacity to be more I always struggle with this word, to have more equanimity in the challenge. When we're being faced with challenges, we have the ability to root and get centered. And we have the ability to start to look at the challenges in our lives through the lens of, okay, what's in this for me? What's the lesson here for me? Instead of stopping ourselves short. The brain responds very well to using creativity as a tool for shifting your narrative.
I
So
love
it is fun, and it's fun, that's the other part. It's really fun to sit down and just go, "Okay, if I was gonna rewrite this as a children's story, how would I have the story end, and how could I get to the end of the story in a fun and juicy way?"
I love that for so many different reasons. Um, one is just the act of being creative and fantastic. Like it, I just couldn't help but feel more expansive as you were
Mhm.
saying it. Just so I can see how if someone is going through this process, that they just start feeling better in general. I don't know what the situation is, but you just start feeling better.
Right, right, and you don't just start feeling better, literally, you become stronger.
Mm.
In the research that I did a recent research study in 2020 to 2023, mostly because it took longer because of COVID. Um, and one of the things I had people do was to come into the lab. We measured IgA as a baseline level, and which is an immune function marker. I had them then tell me a story of an event that left them feeling disempowered or victimized. Now, it's important to know that if this is a fresh, raw trauma, this is not the place to do this activity. I mean, you certainly can start, but so you want to process the grief and any trauma you might have. But if you're stuck in a story, and we're all stuck in stories, right? These are the things we talk about when we go out with girlfriends, right? We sit and we talk about, oh, this happened, right? So I had them share a story where they had an event that they felt kind of stuck in that left them feeling either disempowered or victimized. And then I had them, and we, after they told me the story, we went back and measured IgA levels. Well, IgA levels dropped after they shared the story. So they literally didn't feel good anymore. And the body itself was like, my immune function is now going down because I'm in this energy of the story and it's keeping me stuck. So then I had them go into a process where we did a very templated storytelling process. And I had them rewrite the story of the experience through the lens of they either learned something from the story that left them feeling more empowered, or they rewrote the story in such a way that they didn't emerge from the story the victim anymore. They became the victor, or they in some way won something big from the experience. So when they went back and they reread this story, and it was a creative process. It wasn't, they didn't have to be literal. They could call in superpowers. They could call in fantastical creatures, right? I had a whole thing where they could play with glitter. It was a very fun, very, you have no idea how much people love glitter. I think glitter is healing. Glitter itself is a healing phenomenon. So I had them redo the story, rewrite the story, come back and read it to me again. And after they read it to me, their IgA levels went almost back to baseline. And so just shifting into that playful, oh my God, I don't have to be a victim of this, or, oh, this was terrible, but I can see the blessing in this, and shifting that perspective on the story shifted immune response. And I think when we look at the field of narrative psychology, which is kind of an emerging field, we're starting to see that perspective and feeling empowered over situations that maybe in the past have left us feeling disempowered doesn't just make us feel better emotionally. It actually makes the body respond more effectively to being healthy or being well.
that. I love that. You said fresh, raw trauma, it's not appropriate to use this response. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of what can you kinda outline, like, what are the scenarios where this is appropriate? What are scenarios where it's not appropriate?
So I would say if you have not resolved certain aspects of the trauma, like if you just experienced a really major trauma yesterday, let's say you were in a car accident yesterday, the next day is not necessarily the place to start rewriting the story. Now, I will say, if you are practiced in taking back control of the story, if you do this regularly, if you are regularly, systematically exploring your narrative and really get in there and consciously rewriting it, and you have the ability, you've cultivated that muscle of, oh, I don't have to stay in this perspective. I can shift my perspective, and your practice at that. That might be actually a good time for you to start looking at, okay, I had this accident. Where are the blessings? I haven't seen them yet, but I know they're coming. But if you're not practiced at rewriting the story, the day after the accident is not the time to work on it. I would say the place to really start working on the story is when you reach that point in the story when you recognize, oh, this is starting to become sort of rote. So I'll give you an example. When I'm now happily married for the second time, 20 years. But when got divorced from my first husband, um, I went through literally this terribly ritualized evening sort of routine that I had that was not healthy. So I would rush the kids to bed. And then I would pour myself a glass of wine, and I would listen to Dave Matthews, "Grace Is Gone," right, is one my sad song, and I got to the point where I could not wait to get the kids to bed so I could get my wine and feel sorry for myself.
Mm.
And this was not, like, fresh in the divorce. This was, like, now we're working on 2, 3 years afterwards. I'm still really feeling sorry for myself. And that is those places where you start to recognize that you're in a pattern or a habit with the story. Or if you have a story, yeah, you go out with your girlfriends and like you've almost got the story so well memorized that you're like, this is the part in the story where I start to cry, and this is the part in the story where I'm bitter. Like we have those repetitive stories that we tell. Those are the stories you really want to start disrupting.
Oh, that's actually really helpful. Um, and it in many ways, it requires that people are self-aware that
Mhm.
really going on.
Yes, true. And I think so this is where I'm kind of on a mission. I think there's this self
Yes.
there's the self-awareness, right? But there's also I really like to talk about storytelling and teach about storytelling and the impact of storytelling because I think we need to also shift cultural awareness. We are
Mhm.
absolutely in love with terrible stories. I mean, they we are go I mean, you click on anything on Netflix or Amazon or wherever you're watching stuff, every story is horrible. I mean, I mean, yes, there's a redemption arc and sometimes there's a happy ending, but I mean, think about let's look at Grey's Anatomy as an example, right? How many years has this show been on? Like 22 years this show has been on TV now or whatever it is, it's not TV anymore. But it's just like tragedy, trauma, heartbreak. This character has this identity around this heartbreak. This character always has bad luck, chooses the wrong guy. I mean, it's like it's all this negative narrative. And I do think we need to also normalize that, hey, we don't have to stay stuck in this perspective. We can start shifting stories and telling really good, inspiring stories. Those are actually the stories that we kind of also love, but we relegate them over here, like to TED Talks. Like we love TED Talks. They're great, they're inspiring, but that's not what we're watching regularly. Very few people I think are clicking on TED.com and watching really inspiring TED Talks, right? We're usually going down the sort of dark story route. And if you think about again, let's think about the metaphor of going out with your girlfriends. How many times do we sit there and we think, well, actually, my life is going pretty well, but I don't want to talk about that because if I start talking about how great things are and how good things are going, like we run the risk of potentially even triggering people whose lives are not doing well. So we learn to kind of push down the good stuff and kind of sit in that enjoyment of the negative.
Mm.
And I will say, even in the therapeutic world, we focus so much on PTSD, we don't always put our emphasis on post-traumatic growth. And and so we have to start looking at, okay, great, but where's the redemption arc? where do we go from the climax in the story? Why do we stop at the climax of the story and not look at what happened next? What happened next? We're not 16 anymore.
Exactly. I'm a huge believer. In many ways, the feel that I get is where focus goes, our energy flows. And this, you are speaking truth in the world of psychiatry. We're just so focused on the negative, and little attention is paid to just that resilience, post traumatic growth that can happen. I love, love, love it. You talked about a shift in cultural awareness. And are there practical things that people can do to help move in that direction?
Well, I would say, let's start getting brave about sharing good news about our lives. Let's
Mm,
start brave about, not telling the victim story, but and I would even say not even telling the survival story, because we're also really kind of focused on survival. Like, oh, I survived this thing. And we define ourselves from survival, right? And through the lens of survival. Well, what does survival really mean? It means you lived. Right? That's really all it means. It means, okay, I didn't die. Great. That's awesome. That's like baseline. Okay. We didn't die. Yay. Okay. But what comes next? How do we go from talking about not just surviving, but thriving? And I would say to push that boundary is especially us in the healing arts, we have to start normalizing talking about thriving, right? Talking about optimization, telling stories of today is a fantastic day. I've had a fantastic weekend. I had a fantastic year. And I think especially as women, because I think as women, when we do this, we kind of get culturally labeled as bragging, or at least that's how it is in my generation. Like we didn't talk about the good stuff. You didn't talk about, oh, I made X amount of money, or my relationship is really going well, or I'm feeling really good about my body, right? Because there's that fear of like, oh, pride goeth before the fall, or oh, don't talk about that, or don't make other women feel bad, right? And I think we have to start saying, wait, time out. We have the right to talk about what's going well, and we have the right to also talk about what are we dreaming of creating, which is part of the redemption arc, because we also don't talk about our dreams. In fact, if you think about the word dreamer, right? We say to people, "Oh, you're such a dreamer," and that's actually an insult to.
mhm.
Why is it an insult to dream? Like that's the construction of the template of the post traumatic growth, and we're telling people, don't get too big, don't go beyond your britches there, right? And so I think we have to just start really shifting the way in which we talk about ourselves, our successes, and the world, and doing it one story at a time, one coffee with your girlfriends at a time.
I love that. Yeah, there are things that we can do on our own to shift the narrative. The feel that I'm getting is that you doing this on your own, the vision I'm having is like a ripple effect, that it affects your family, your community, it just spreads. Uh, I I wonder, because you talked about it from a very individual standpoint, are because there are some of our listeners are up there heading organizations. What can organizations do? Uh,
Oh, I love working with organizations because that exact same process works with organizations. So I'm working with an organization right now it's actually a micro college. It's a nonprofit organization.
oh,
They just realized in their process of looking at how do we expand the organization that they actually didn't have a 25-year vision for what they were building. They're sort of renegade. They have some really innovative ideas. They've got students, they've got a school, but it's a pretty interesting sort of patchwork of what they're creating, and it's brilliant and it's beautiful. But they wanted to put together a vision. And so we actually went back and we said, okay, time out. Let's look at where are you at now with your story. And in their story as an organization, they were, we nobody wants to pay for what we have because it's fringy, right? So that was part of their narrative. And when you're trying to build on 80 acres of land, you're trying to hire an architect and do, project design, and you don't have money, or you have beliefs about money that are limiting. They had to really work on, oh my gosh, this is part of our identity. We as an organization are telling a story that nobody wants to pay for what we have, right? They were also telling a story, and this was a very interesting part of the narrative that we worked on. Part of their story was very much about being rebels, which was great, but the way to a certain degree, because they needed to harness that energy of, "Okay, we're doing something innovative," but the way that they were living out that rebellion story was, "We're not like everybody else." So they were not being like everybody else, but they really weren't defining clearly who are they for? Who are they? They knew very well who they weren't, but they didn't really know who they were.
Mm.
And then we had to talk about, okay, in that light, what else where do you wanna go and how do you wanna what do you wanna create? So, we literally took a whole month meeting as we met with the board. We took the whole story apart and we collectively, as an organization, rewrote a story. It was a fairy tale about this school and what was gonna happen in the school over the arc of 25 years. And it was such a synthesizing, coherent a way for them to bring a vision together jointly onto the table to really get clear about their current narrative and to really look at how do we shift this narrative and how do we call in this bigger vision in this really fun and playful way. So it's a great tool to use with organizations.
I thank you for sharing that example because I see it. I see it. I see such there's so much potential in doing that. I think that sometimes we get stuck, like within people who are heading organization get stuck in a particular story, but just seeing just how using this technique that you can transform that um that that narrative is so beautiful. I know that our listeners are absolutely going to want to connect with you. Tell us, how do we do that?
So the easiest way to connect with me is to go to my website, which is quantumhumandesign.com, which is what you can do on that website, which is kind of fun, is you can run your human design chart from that site, which is actually what we had talked about earlier in our conversation, a way for you to sort of get a systematic approach, a snapshot approach to how do I start looking at the layers of my story and how do I start looking at my personal story, my personal potential and soul curriculum, and how do I start rewriting that so that I'm taking back control over my story and telling it the way I choose.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. And last question, what does stepping into soul power mean for you?
I love that question. So to me, that means getting yourself deeply rooted and grounded in your authentic story. Because when you have that as your root, when you are grounded in this is who I am, this is who I was born to be, this is my soul curriculum, this is what I came here to learn and what I came here to give the world. When you're connected to that, you become unstoppable because you have a big why now that connects you to anything and everything. And so, no matter what blows this way, no matter what goes on in the current environment, you have this grounded place that keeps you connected to purpose. It keeps your ears open. It helps you drown out the noise and the chaos and lets you stand in the middle of a storm and be the one that can lead people out.
Lovely. Dr. Karen Parker, it was wonderful to have you on. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
If you haven't heard it yet today, I appreciate you. The soul in me honors the soul in you. If you'd like to see more episodes like this, please subscribe or click here. And friends, if this spoke to you, leave a comment below. We would love to hear from you.